All right. That was Grand Cross by Ringmaster. That's Gloria's band from back in the day when she was touring, a touring musician. It must have been a really fun time. Anyway, I'm Jayme CheeseSlice, the engineer producer of Uncontrolled Opposition. Welcome to the show today. I think we've got a good one. We're going to be talking about the divisiveness that is caused by identity politics with Professor Gabriel Rockhill. And we're going to call him Gabriel because that's how he rolls. So, um, if this is your first time ever watching this show, and I know they say this every week, but sometimes it's going to be somebody's first time. So, if it's your first time watching this, we are a radio show first and foremost. We have to record for a session for the radio. We're going to do that anyway. So, we decided that we're going to go ahead and do it right here live on YouTube so you can watch it. And then afterwards, I'm going to take this show and edit it down to an hour block specifically for the radio, and we're on WBAI in New York and also the Progressive Radio Network. And if you have a local political station in your neck of the woods, shoot us an email. Maybe we can pitch our show to that station and they could broadcast this there too. Or maybe if you know somebody that works at a station, you could tell them to check us out, and we might be the kind of content they want. Anyhow, let's get on with the show. I'm going to go ahead and bring on our host, Gloria and Jeremy. Hello,
Hey.
guys. How are you? I think this is a subject that I know, Gloria, you're very excited about. So I don't want to hold you back from it too much longer.
And our audience, I've gotten such positive feedback. People are just dying to hear Gabriel.
Yeah. Did I hear an echo there? Can you speak again?
Hey, is there an echo?
Well, your microphone sounds like it's off.
It sounds like it's off. It's
Yeah, it sounds like it's picking up your computer microphone instead of the microphone in front of your face.
Oh, geez.
Which it was working just before we went live. It was working perfectly fine.
Let's see. No, it's picking up properly. It says I have echo cancellation on.
Do you have your microphone selected? It worked great before we went live.
Yeah, no, it is. It is.
Hold on a second. Let me mute Jeremy. How does it sound now? Test it again.
Hello? Test, test, test. 1, 2, 3, test.
Yeah, it's picking this. It's not picking up the mic that's in front of you anymore.
Okay.
That's your background microphone.
All right, we'll change.
Or your webcam microphone.
Okay, is that any better?
No. And while Gloria is figuring this out, I'm going to go ahead and bring on Gabriel. So maybe you can help us give some feedback. Are you hearing what I'm hearing, Gabriel?
I do hear a little bit of an echo. You hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine too. Maybe it's just me.
Well,
that's
okay.
possible.
How's that? Is that any better? Test, test, test. Test.
That's fine for me.
No, I'm not double broadcasting it. It just sounds like all the speakers
Is
I'm
that
hearing.
any better?
It just sounds like you guys are in a big open room and you're in the back of the room talking and the microphone's picking you up. Jeremy,
No,
can I hear what you sound like too?
Okay, hello?
Yeah, it might just be me. I hope it's not.
Is
just
it the
me.
same when I speak?
Yeah, it's all of you. So it might just be me.
I hear the other two speakers fine, just FYI.
Does everybody sound the way they did before we started going live?
For me, yes.
Okay, it might just be me then.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
I think I'm okay.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Back to
Let me
me.
go ahead and start. I'm going to hand over to Gloria, and she's going to start the show with her
Welcome,
monologue.
Gabriel. We're so happy to have you here.
Oh, yes, welcome. Thank you for being here. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and start with Gloria, and let's get this show on the road because we got to record for an hour. And we'll be done just right after noon today on the East Coast.
So this is just extra content for people who watch. Sometimes we even.
Well, I mean,
talk
we
a
got to
little
make
bit
sure we have
into
the
it.
audio right, so because that's what's important for the radio.
Okay, wait, just give me 1 second there. Okay. It's giving me a hard time with my background.
You ready?
No, just give me 1 second.
Okay.
Okay. All right, let's see if it holds. It gives me
Okay.
hell. Okay, let me
All
get
right,
rid of
let's
this.
go.
Wait. Okay. All right. Okay. Hey everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jayme, CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest, not those of WBAI or the Pacifica Foundation. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today, we welcome professor, author, and philosopher Gabriel Rockhill as our guest. While many interviewers are surprised by his theories, we aren't. His critique of the so-called left resonates with what we have seen and personally experienced. At Uncontrolled Opposition, we have watched the left become increasingly divided by identity politics, increasingly supportive of institutions it once distrusted, and increasingly willing to abandon principles that once defined the anti-war movement, not only in academia, but also in so-called progressive political groups like the DSA and Green Party, as well as in so-called anti-imperialist and peace activist groups and in alternative left media. My co-host Jeremy Kuzmarov has had many stories on how he and other professors are routinely sidelined for teaching actual history and current events, and not the fairy tales that serve the predator class in corporate and co-opted alternative media. I have personally experienced what happens when identity becomes more important than material reality. Along with other women, I was kicked out of the Green Party's Women's Caucus by weaponized men in drag who identify as women. I believe this was set up by my New York State delegation to block me from any leadership role. The New York leadership favors sending weapons to Ukraine and health mandates, two positions I strongly oppose. Lastly, changing identity does not alter biological reality. Putting on blackface does not make someone African American and entitled to reparations. Putting on a rock t-shirt does not make a 50-year-old man a teenager and okay to date 13-year-old girls. Believing something about yourself does not automatically make it objectively true. And when the deep state wants to infiltrate or destabilize a so-called left movement, what better chaos agent could there be than someone presented as occupying multiple intersectional oppressed identities? The so-called left loves the word intersectional and using Venn diagrams. And we've just put up a visual Venn diagram, and it shows gender, nationality, disability, and sexuality and racial identity. Nowhere does it list any class consciousness or analysis. And the next screen, Jayme. And the next screen shows class analysis. It shows 4 men basically holding up a big fat guy. And on his platform, it says the word prophet. So, what are we arguing? That we want to replace one of these men with a woman? Are we arguing that we want to replace one of these men with a person in a wheelchair? No, what we want to do is we want to focus on the unequal relationship between workers and the ruling elite, or the predator class, as we call them, or the capitalist class, if we're going to use Marxist language. And then if you have the third slide up, that'd be great. The third slide shows Gina Haspel. And, as a woman, I do not feel empowered knowing that Gina Haspel, the torturer in chief, was the CIA director. So, Jimmy Dore had made a joke about her breaking the glass ceiling. And, I'm not going to do it as well as Jimmy Dore, but I'll say, yeah. And then she takes a shard of broken glass and tortures you with it. So I'm not feeling the liberation in this. Okay, back to the monologue. So the problem with Oppression Olympics is when every political question becomes a contest over who possesses the greatest victim status, social cohesion, and class consciousness disappear. I have met young professors at alumni events who believe the United States should interfere in Nicaragua, Myanmar, Iran, and Afghanistan because so-called progressive influencers and hip-looking organizations, secretly funded by billionaires, told them intervention was necessary. Responsibility to protect, R2P, what a ruse. It is the colonial exploitation excuse, white man's burden, repackaged for today's audience's consumption. These positions would have been unthinkable to SUNY Westbury's most honorable professors that I knew back in the late 70s and early 80s. I've also watched climate activists demand that impoverished countries abandon fossil fuels while ignoring the realities of denied energy access and blocked economic development while they travel by jet. And then came the pandemic. The so-called left demanded mandates, embraced CIA and FBI surveillance technologies, abandoned skepticism towards corporate power, defended big pharma, celebrated tech billionaires, and even opposed Canadian labor activists defending their own economic interests. They called multiculti truckers the Flu Klux Klan. Remarkably, these positions emerged in lockstep with funding and influence from figures and foundations associated with Soros, Singham, Ford, and Gates. And that brings us to Professor Gabriel Rockhill. There is a question academia almost never asks out loud. Who paid for the ideas you were taught? Professor Rockhill examines what he describes as the cultural Cold War. He argues that the CIA and other state agencies and major foundations helped wage an intellectual campaign against class consciousness through funding institutions, publications, conferences, and cultural influence. According to Dr. Rockhill, the goal was not necessarily to eliminate the left, but to cultivate a compatible left, one that could sound radical and mobilize public anger while stopping short of challenging the fundamental structures of economic and political power. He argues that political energy can then be redirected away from class struggle and towards competing identities, fragmenting people who share common material interests while leaving ownership, wealth, and power largely untouched. That is the essence of what Jeremy and I call controlled opposition. And controlled opposition does not require everyone involved be knowingly controlled. Sincere activists can participate in important sounding movements. However, the ultimate direction is being shaped by institutions with very different objectives. A dividing working class is a powerless working class. The question isn't, is the left being manipulated? It's who benefits from the direction in which the left is being led to slaughter. To riff on the title of Gabriel's latest book, the question is not only who paid the piper, but why are we still dancing to the tune? Please get Professor Gabriel Rockhill's book titled Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, published by Monthly Review Press on December 1st, 2025. Thanks.
Thank you, Gloria.
Gabriel, please detail the origins and fingerprints of the compatible left and the responses you've gotten from pulling back the curtain on cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School, and identity politics.
Thank you so much for having me on. The goal of this book was to elucidate what I refer to as the political economy of knowledge production. So recognizing that knowledge is not simply the result of individual geniuses thinking on their own, or even isolated communities hunkering down in a supposed ivory tower in order to advance claims to human knowledge, but is instead the consequence of material systems of knowledge production, distribution, and consumption that in a capitalist world order are owned and controlled directly or indirectly by the capitalist ruling class. And so in many ways, my book is an attempt to use the methodological tools of historical and dialectical materialism, Marxism, in order to interrogate the history of Marxism itself and to ask a number of questions, one of which is, why is it that the left has become so compatible since at least World War II, meaning compatible with capitalism and imperialism? But then also within that question, the status of what some people call Western, cultural, or academic Marxism, a version of Marxism that preaches revolution, radical social transformation, but whose substantive politics, surprisingly perhaps, at least from a certain vantage point, end up lining up with imperialist interests. The investigation itself explores, as you mentioned, the role of the US national security state and the foundation complex of the capitalist ruling class. It does also insist on the fact that the material institutions of knowledge production, here I'm thinking of universities, the book industry, the journal industry, the conference networks, the media complex, all of these institutions often function more or less autonomously insofar as they don't need direct intervention on the part of state operators or foundations, because they themselves are superstructural outgrowths of the capitalist order, meaning that the university that we have, for instance, in a country like the United States, is deeply, deeply embedded within the capitalist order. The objective then of undertaking this analysis is to reveal not only what forms of knowledge are privileged, but also those that are invisibilized, sidelined, or in certain instances eliminated, or at least there are attempts to eliminate them. And so the anti-imperialist Marxist tradition, which has identified with the struggles of the most oppressed and exploited members of the global working class, has either been sidelined or just directly attacked by the same material institutions that I just mentioned. Now, the reactions to this particular book that was published in December can basically be summed up in a kind of twofold manner. On the one hand, those who are major publishers or icons within the broad theory industry driven by the United States have reacted as guard dogs who attempt to police those who even have the right to public discourse by attacking and slandering me in the most heinous manner possible with ad hominem attacks, and claiming that the book is nothing more than a harebrained conspiracy theorist that grew out of my own peasant consciousness because I happened to grow up on a farm in Kansas. Well, at the same time that these gatekeepers are circling the wagons in order to try to hold on to what is ultimately, in my opinion, the sinking ship of the imperial theory industry, the other reaction has been an incredible level of interest on the part of peoples across the global South in particular, and resolute anti-imperialists in the global North. And so, to put it very simplistically, it's either been all love or all hate, depending on, in many ways, how one is materially situated within the overall global dynamics of imperialism. And so what's interesting about this response, in my opinion, is not so much the individual slander or mudslinging, which I anticipated because it has happened in the past, but rather the systemic nature and what it reveals about the very thesis of the book, insofar as if people read the book closely and understand its fundamental argument, then you should be able to anticipate this type of response, meaning it's an ideological response conditioned by the very material institutions that I analyze in the book. Regarding identity politics, there'd be a lot to say, and so I'll take a first stab at a few things, and then I'm curious to hear from the two of you additional thoughts.
One thing I want to just say, just for clarification, is that there's a lot of misconceptions as to who is the capitalist class, or what is the capitalist class, and people are like, well, I don't want the dentist who lives on my block to be my enemy, because they somehow think that the petty bourgeois, which is in the language of Marxism, is really the capitalist class. No, they're not. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what is the capitalist class. They're the class that own and control the means of production. So it's the difference between, the doctor who has a nice house on your block and Elon Musk. It's a huge difference. I mean, we have a situation where I think there's 10 people, 10 individuals in the United States that own like most of the world's wealth. I mean, it's just, this is the capitalist class, not your neighbor. We need to join together with our neighbors, not pick at each other on who has a dollar or more or less. Thank you.
No, that's exactly it. I mean, the distinction between private and personal property is helpful. Private property is the ownership of the means of production and of distribution, and for that matter, communication and everything else. But we're talking about the people who own the factories, the land, the Amazon warehouses and distribution networks. This is the Walmart family. This is Jeff Bezos. This is Elon Musk. This is very different than personal property. So you could be a small business owner. You could own your house. You could own a few houses or something like this. And you are still, if you have to work for a wage in order to survive, you are a member of the working class. And it's important to recognize that the working class is stratified, and this actually relates directly to identity politics, so hopefully we can make these connections. But that stratification doesn't mean that your dentist is your enemy. On the contrary, your dentist as a worker, if your dentist doesn't happen to be Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, but I don't think those guys have to use a side hustle like doing dentistry. They have plenty of wealth on their own, stolen from the workers of the world. The way in which there have been kind of anti-socialist propaganda campaigns run against the left has confused people a lot in this regard. The great Michael Parenti, who passed not long ago, often said, things along the lines of, it's not the small mom and pop shops that we're talking about. You can be a small business owner and you still are actually being squeezed out by the monopoly capitalists, who are those who own more or less everything. So the capitalist ruling class is an extremely small fraction of humanity that is destroying the livelihoods and the environment for the overwhelming majority of humanity. In relationship to identity politics, I think it is important to recognize how it developed historically. So if we understand by identity politics a specific way of understanding social conflict that is rooted in supposed fixed identities, such as racial categories, gender, sexual, they can also be national, they can be religious, and that these categories usually are understood in an essentialist fashion. So there's something like blackness, womanness, being a real Jew or something like this. And that even if these have certain histories or have been modified over time, they end up being more or less static building blocks out of which social communities are forged. And that the primary way in which we need to analyze society is in terms of the relationship between these different fixed identity categories. What this approach invisibilizes is the fact that these categories are historically produced and that they have changed over time. They continue to change over time, granted, often in certain instances, very slowly and incrementally. But from a historical materialist vantage point, we can analyze those changes and also then identify the ways in which certain categories, we can take the category of the contemporary categories of race that we have in the United States, are deeply embedded within the history of the capitalist world system, so that the categories themselves cannot be fully understood historically unless they are situated in relationship to the system of socioeconomic production out of which they emerge and have developed. Just as a quick example, maybe your listeners are familiar with the well-known book, How the Irish Became White, that tells the story of the Irish working class who were classified as colored. They were racialized as colored in the United States because of the ways in which they were integrated at low levels of the overall labor pyramid. But over time, due to a series of complex issues, they were able to move up the labor pools or the labor hierarchy and also assimilate in various ways to the dominant white culture within the United States and reconfigure some of those racial categories. And these are complex histories that I can't sum up succinctly, but it's just to demonstrate the fact that these categories actually aren't fixed. They're the result not only of history, but more specifically of class struggle, both from above on the part of the capitalist ruling class and from below on the part of the broader working class. The other thing that I wanted to say about identity politics in this sense is it really came to its developed form in the United States in the broader neoliberal phase of capitalist accumulation. And it grew out of earlier developments, such as certain forms of cultural nationalism within the New Left, or even going back to the social chauvinist forms in the early 20th century. But what it was able to do and continues to do, and I think your intro clearly highlighted this, is to divide and conquer the global working class. Because given how small the ownership class is, they have a fundamental contradiction on their hands. And that is, well, how do you conquer and maintain hegemony or power over the working class if the working class is the overwhelming majority of the population? And one of the tried and true tactics is you need to divide and conquer them. So you produce, foster, promote ideologies that try to convince people that they're not first and foremost a member of the global proletariat, the global working class, the people who have to work for a wage, otherwise they wouldn't survive. But instead, you're first and foremost a member of a certain racial, gender, sexual, religious, national, go on down the list, category. And this is what defines you primarily. And therefore, if you want to get involved in political organizing in some capacity, you should focus on issues that deal with your particular category. What this has done, unfortunately, and this was part of the way in which it's been weaponized by interests in the ruling class, their foundation managers, the US national security state, and other interested parties, is to set workers against one another instead of recognizing all that they share. The other thing that I would highlight in this regard, because I think it's extremely important, is that this is not, the position that I take is not what liberals often refer to as class reductionist. The idea that, well, race, gender, sexuality, none of these things matter. All that really counts is how you are situated within economic hierarchies. This form of class reductionism is actually just the result of the liberal ideology that isolates the economy from the larger social world. The historical and dialectical materialist tradition never does this. They engage in political economy and they recognize that there's not a separate sphere called the economy. This is important, though, as well, because the class struggles that have existed historically are class struggles that have been racialized and have been gendered. And therefore, there are important ways in which we have to understand the racial, gender, and other dynamics as part of the deep material history of these class struggles. To make that maybe a little bit more clear in case it's too abstract, the processes of racialization that humanity, right? Because there are not races. Nobody has scientifically proven that there are different races. There's only humanity. But in order to divide and conquer the global working class, one of the tactics that's been deployed has been to racialize people and identify them as first and foremost, black, brown, yellow, red, etc., not as members of the family of Homo sapiens. And in doing so, this can then justify their super exploitation or their greater exploitation in relationship to the global pyramids of labor. In this regard, if you really want to understand the history of racism, which is a very true phenomenon, you need a materialist analysis that looks at the social and economic forces, and in particular imperialism, that's been driving the racialization of humans in order to pit them against one another. To bring all of that to a close, and then I'll wrap up here for follow-up questions and comments, This basically amounts to, and I'm sorry for the complicated term, but I'll explain it in very simple and straightforward manner, a dialectical analysis of identity politics. And by a dialectical analysis, we can mean something here very simply, and that is that you look at any phenomenon from multiple perspectives, and in particular, from at least the perspective of the ruling class and from the broader working class. And so identity politics for the ruling class is a way of dividing and conquering the global working class. From the point of view of the general working class, though, what identity politics is an attempt to take the history of racialized, gendered, sexual class struggles and reduce them to battles over fixed identities that either eliminate or sideline class analysis and class struggle, and thereby serve ultimately the interests of the ruling class. But this doesn't mean that then we have to abandon and sacrifice any account of things like race, gender, sexuality, etc., and slip into, which sometimes unfortunately does happen even on the left, a kind of social chauvinism in which you simply say, well, none of these issues really matter. In fact, they matter very deeply and are extremely important to the deep history of the Marxist tradition, which the heritage of identity politics has been quite overtly attacking in many ways.
And maybe, Gabriel, yeah, it's very important insights you're making. And yeah, I really enjoyed reading your book. Maybe you can address a couple things, how this plays out in the academy, and just some of the, detail in your book, and particularly address the importance of Herbert Marcuse and the New Left as far as, diverting social movements away from class struggle and into identity politics. And I mean, Marcuse is kind of a compelling historical figure. I mean, he was quite radical. He was against U.S. foreign policies. On the other hand, he was, as you show, I think, very important in this shift that you're describing, or this manipulation of the political left. And he had a background in the intelligence services.
Yeah, thank you for that. The book itself does go into great detail about the ways in which the US Academy is not separate from, in a deep and meaningful way, state actors and the broader capitalist ruling class. So much so that I refer to a kind of financial state intellectual nexus. And a big shout out to Jeremy, because I know that you've been doing a lot of important work on this as well. In fact, I just reposted an excellent article that you wrote on the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a Central Intelligence Agency offshoot, and the extent to which it has deep connections across the academy, and in particular, the most elite institutions of the US Academy. Regarding Marcuse himself, he first was involved in the Office of War Information and Propaganda Agency. Then he worked for the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor organization of the CIA. And then he was a long-time State Department operative. So much so that, in my opinion, the leading researcher on regarding the Marcuse archives, Mueller is his name, identifies Marcuse as the leading specialist on communism in the State Department. And during that time, he worked closely with a series of intellectuals who'd go on to become quite famous in the post-war era, some of whom already were renowned prior to that point in time, but then also rubbed shoulders with many of the foundation managers who would continue to fund not only him directly, but also the Frankfurt School, which is the kind of general academic institution of which he was a part. In particular, the Rockefellers were big funders of both Marcuse and the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Marcuse, like the most well-known elements from the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, these were figures who were turning against the forms of Marxism that supported actually existing socialism in the East, and generally developing a mode of analysis that focused more on culture than political economy, and often also engaged in a kind of, this is pre-identity politics as far as the terminology is concerned, but a culturalist analysis, meaning looking at identities and struggles over underrepresented, underprivileged identities, rather than really centering a class analysis. I chart this all out in the book in a long chapter. It's hard to sum up here, but it is very important to recognize that Marcuse has his own trajectory, and he didn't simply maintain one position from beginning to end. He was radicalized by the anti-imperialist movement, by some of his students in the 60s. He has a very long FBI file on him that I've read in full, and it is clear that they considered him to be dangerous. And the New Left, I think, in general, needs to be understood in terms of a kind of double-edged sword, because on the one hand, the New Left was a very useful weapon of war against the Old Left, against those who are understood, at least by, interested parties, as being a class-focused form of Marxist left. And instead, the New Left was embracing new struggles around various identities, if they be, anything from gender, race, sexuality, etc. At the same time, the New Left was recognized, and I'm sure others like the two of you have read through these documents as well, as a threat insofar as it was also questioning US imperialism and taking certain radical positions. And so I think in a refined analysis, we have to be able to account for both of those phenomena, while at the same time remaining very clear-eyed about what the most important line of demarcation is for the US national security state. And that is, the greatest threat to imperialism isn't US American radicals who traffic in kind of anarchist or radical liberal forms of organizing, but instead, as they identify in so many of their internal documents, Marxism-Leninism as the philosophy that has accompanied the global socialist movement, because it's socialist state-building projects that have been the greatest impediment to the spread of imperialism. And in that regard, I think we have to be able to bring all of that clearly into focus.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there is some gray because it's not entirely black and white in the sense that Marcuse did have an understanding of Soviet communism. I mean, there was an underside of Soviet communism, as far as some of the oppression, and the Bolshevik. Because I've studied Soviet history, the Bolsheviks, turning on the Mensheviks, and I mean, the Gulag was real, and there was no political freedom in the Soviet Union. So I mean, he was highlighting some repressive features of the Soviet system, accurately, at least from my point of view. On the other hand, what you're saying, I think, is very important. That ultimately, though, that system was the greatest threat to U.S. imperialism because of its emphasis on nationalizing resources and challenging the banking cartels. And I mean, there were real achievements of the Soviet Union that Marcuse was not addressing. And I think the New Left turned away from. I mean, that was probably crucial impact he had, that because he developed this analysis, right, that the American capitalism and Soviet communism were both kind of two sides of the same coin, this bureaucratic, oppressive system. So that turned people away from looking to, as you say, actual socialist states as a potential alternative model. And that's had long, ramification. On the left today relates to what Gloria is talking about. People don't look to Nicaragua as a state. They're actually supporting the undermining of the Nicaraguan government because they highlight the oppressive features of that state or Venezuela. So it has important, I think, ramification. And the other thing is, like with the left today, so fixated on identity politics, like with the Palestine, Free Palestine is a slogan, not, fight the Pentagon or, America come home. it's free Palestine. To me, that epitomizes this identity politics. So I don't know what your thoughts on these points.
Yeah, I would say that there is a way that Marcuse, like others in the Frankfurt School, did help consolidate a certain quite prevalent ideology on the part of the compatible left intelligentsia in the imperial core, and that is the ideology of neither Washington nor Moscow. We've heard this again and again. Most recently, it's neither Washington nor Tehran. You just plug in whoever the enemy of U.S. imperialism is at any given point in time to the latter half of that expression, and you get the basic simplistic logic of a lot of the compatible left intelligentsia, like the Guardian letter that just came out that I'm sure that you saw, that has gotten a lot of pushback, which I think is a very positive development. And what they offer instead of that is an imaginary and illusory third way politics. The idea that, well, capitalism is bad, socialist state building projects are bad, but there's this other way of doing things that we can maybe imagine or have utopian aspirations around. And yet, when it comes to a materialist analysis of the actual world that we live in, not utopian dream, the utopian dreamscape of certain academics, then you recognize that, well, the third way politics are largely an illusion in order to try to get people to tap out from global class struggle and say, no, I'm on the sidelines of this. I don't have to choose between imperialism and anti-imperialism. I choose the position of individual moral dignity that would never traffic in anything that the anti-imperialists are doing or what the imperialists are doing. This is individual liberal moralism that is devoid of a materialist analysis as well as a grounding in the reality of global class struggle. Regarding the history of the Soviet Union, it is a history that I think needs to, and fortunately is being revisited from various different perspectives, in large part because US American Sovietology, which has dominated as well the media scape on the history of the Soviet Union, is largely a product of the national security state, insofar as, and I outline this in the book, the first two area studies programs in the United States were founded at Columbia and at Harvard. And they were to study the Soviet Union. They were Russian studies, area studies programs, and they were Central Intelligence Agency cutouts that relocated many of the staff researchers from the U.S. national security state to these two institutions. Again, I go into all of the details about this in the book, so I won't sum up all of them now.
And yeah, I just as a short, I have an article coming out on Philip Mosley, who is the dean of Sovietology studies, and he was a CIA agent, and I analyzed his writings, and yeah, he really promoted this fervent anti-communism and pro-imperialism. So
I can't wait to read it. No, because Philip Mosley figures very prominently in the book because he was a close personal friend of Herbert Marcuse. Their families dined together. They worked and collaborated for years on numerous projects, and Mosley continued to invite Marcuse back to the Russian Institute and was involved in the Princeton Consultancy Group, which I'm sure you've come across, a group of academics that would meet with the top brass of the U.S. national security state to develop national intelligence estimates at Princeton University 4 times a year. He was a major, major operator. He was also the operational man behind the Marxism-Leninism project funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, whose goal was really to develop, well, what we now call Western Marxism or imperial Marxism, a version of Marxism that was palatable to the imperial ruling class while attacking actually existing socialism. But all of that to say, to kind of come back to your earlier point, I do think that a lot of Marcuse's writings, I mean, Soviet Marxism comes directly out of the work that he was doing for the State Department, and he admits as much himself. It was basically U.S. national security state research that he was doing, and the other publications that were coming out of these two institutions, at least early on, were deeply, deeply embedded within the kind of broader interests of the US national security state. So I don't think we should only take these publications and their echoes within the broader media sphere with a grain of salt. I think we should highly question them. One of the things that I've been investigating as of late, just to give you an idea, is that according to the Black Book on Communism, which has been completely discredited because it's, completely, just absolutely lacking in any form of scholarly rigor, claim that, the communists killed 100 million people and things like this. The archives were opened up in the Soviet Union in the 90s, and now we have greater access to the material history of the gulags, and we now know that the number is much closer to 2.4 million people. And the history of how they were killed, what crimes they committed, if they did commit crimes, and all of that is quite complex. And I think we have to work through and process all of that rather than just rely on the kind of atrocity propaganda. And none of this is to say, Jeremy, that I don't have my own critiques, or I don't think we should have a critical relationship to the Soviet Union or other actually existing socialist states. On the contrary, criticism is the lifeblood of these traditions because it's how they improve over time. And it is also the case that these states have had to make decisions not just based on the form of socialism that they want, right? Often on the Western left, people think, well, I have this idea of socialism. Why don't they do it like I want them to do it? Well, maybe it's because a little thing called imperialist siege, where they don't have the opportunity to do the perfect version of socialism because they're being constantly attacked with the most heinous and violent forms of terrorism, destabilization, propaganda campaigns that are just absolutely constant. And so you can't have socialism survive in an imperialist world unless you have a strong state. The socialists didn't decide on this. They're reacting to material reality. And if you don't think that's the case, then, look at what has happened. Anytime there's either a weaker state or a small state, it'll be crushed almost immediately. And so all of that creates certain contradictions, of course, within the socialist projects, but contradictions that we have to analyze from the perspective of global class struggle, not, as the Western left often does, a comparison between my ideal picture as an armchair academic of what socialism should be, and then what I see a particular state doing, usually completely divorced from the material relations within which that state is operating.
Absolutely, and that was one of my critique of these NED professors. They wrote this history, this guy at Harvard and University of Toronto, and they leave out the U.S. invasion of Russia. When you had the Russian Revolution of 1917, immediately they were under attack by a foreign invasion of 6 countries.
14
14 countries. Yeah. And as you say, they were pioneering all these bombing and poisonous gases, and they leave that out of their history, among other things. So just right away, it's a totally biased presentation. And that's what we're getting, today in the academy with these, CIA-linked professors. And we can go on about that, but go ahead, Gloria.
Yeah, I just had a couple of points. And, Jeremy and I talk a lot about what gets someone assassinated. And, we have 3 luminaries that we discuss often: Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King. And they were, what made them so dangerous was not their radical opinions, but their ability to unite different people from different backgrounds and bring people together. And I just wanted to, read a quote from Fred Hampton. And it says, "We say that we will work with anybody and form a coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind." So that is what makes people dangerous. It's unity. That is what, as you said, that is what the predator class is concerned with. It's unity, because they are few and we are many. So that's one point. And then the other point I wanted to make, if I don't forget it, is nope, I think it just slipped out. But anyway, we got that point in. The other point I wanted to make is this thing that Jeremy and I talk about a lot is this concept of needing an enemy, and how having an enemy is uniting people in the direction that the predator class wants people united. If we say, oh, it's communism, and people don't even understand what communism means, and I can tell you that, and people don't understand what socialism means, and people really don't understand what capitalism means. So I try to stay away from those isms just so that I can connect better to our audience. So when we talk about socialism, we're talking about something like Social Security. It helps. It protects our elderly, and Medicare and Medicaid protect our impoverished. I mean, these are programs that are social, and our transportation system that's funded by our national government. These are things that you need. You have to have roadways connecting. So, when you say social, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, "Oh my God, it's socialism." Because you hear people saying, "Oh, it's socialism, it's so terrible," but we have socialism, and it works in the United States. What we also have, which is even more dangerous, is we have socialism approved for the capitalist class and for corporations, and we have hardcore capitalism for the rest of us. So the rest of us are pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, while the capitalists are getting all these deductions and benefits and fantastic stuff. So we have socialism in this country. It's just to the wrong group. It's to these, 10 families, and not to the rest of us.
That's such a good point, because I think one easy way of understanding what socialism is and connecting it to the earlier discussion concerning the owner of, or the owners of, the means of production is that a society in which there's not private ownership, meaning there's not ownership of the means of production, distribution, communication, etc. There's still personal property, right? So you're not going to take people's houses or cars away from them or things like this. But what the abolition of private property means is that the wealth produced by workers can be cycled back to them in the form of free or affordable healthcare, housing, education, access to employment, cultural development, a sustainable environment. There's an enormous amount of wealth that goes upward. Socialism is about redistributing that wealth, not to make everybody do the same or turn us into these, homogenous robots or things like this, but to provide not only a minimum of a social safety net, but also to allow people to develop culturally as full human beings. It's a humanist project. Regarding the other points that you made, I think that the reference to Hampton is very apropos, because his Rainbow Coalition really speaks to one of the ways in which the Marxist heritage has engaged very seriously and well before identity politics with the woman question, with what was called the national question, and sought to address those issues in material terms. If you want to abolish the oppression of women and racialized groups, you cannot do it simply by different ways of speaking or forms of representation or a few glass ceilings. You have to change the material labor relations that organize society. And in doing that, you can then eliminate the basis, the material basis, out of which racism, misogyny grow. That doesn't mean that you don't fight oppression as well. What it means is you go to the root cause of oppression. And as we know from many socialist state building projects, this has been precisely one of the objectives, right? If it be, there's many different examples that I could cite, but the family code in Cuba, the most progressive one in the world, many people have claimed that if racism hasn't been abolished, it's at least been set back in major ways within Cuba due to the ways in which there's been a reconfiguration of the socioeconomic system such that those who are subjected to super exploitation, domestic slavery, etc., are not those who have been systematically, or that those ways in which that has happened have either been eliminated or at least attenuated as much as possible. The other thing that I just wanted to highlight about Malcolm and Martin Luther King Jr. is that they were also going, particularly you see this in King's work, they were drifting in an increasingly socialist and even explicitly socialist direction with the support of the workers' movement, with Malcolm's recognition that you couldn't just, focus on organizing the Black population, the kind of Black nationalism that was in some of his earlier work. And so it was this more universalist recognition that we bring all workers in for a struggle against the real enemy, which is the capitalist ruling class. And that brings me to your final point, and that is that one of the things that the imperial mind managers do is they oversee attention management. They try to get us to identify as our enemy people who are not our enemy, and thereby fight ourselves instead of fighting them. And this weaponization, if you will, is very powerful, because then your eye kind of moves off the ball, so to speak, and you don't recognize that, well, if the system we live in is one in which the wealth produced by workers is siphoned off by a parasitic class that needs to be named as the Epstein class,
And the
insofar as
predator
they're not
class,
only
we'll call them.
heinous economically, but morally and politically, they are utterly and thoroughly corrupt, running an international network of pedophilia that has been proven, and yet no one has been held accountable in any serious manner, right? We have Ghislaine Maxwell in velvet covered handcuffs or whatever in a jail of sorts, but you don't have any real crackdown on these networks, which means they still exist, right? That Epstein class is the real enemy, not the workers from Latin America who have immigrated to this country because their countries have been destroyed by US imperialism and they're looking to make a wage that they might be able to share with their families, not the Chinese who are developing their own project of socialism with Chinese characteristics in order to dig their way out from the century of humiliation, which was a century of colonial and neo-colonial depredation. These are not your enemies. The enemies are the Epstein class that are stealing from you and increasingly destroying the conditions of possibility of human existence by, at this point in time, particularly in the United States, denying human-made climate change and therefore precipitating the end of the natural world as we know it, meaning Habitat for Humanity, right? It's the killer class, the predatory class, that is the real enemy, and we have to be crystal clear about that. Otherwise, we fall for their propaganda and the managers that they've hired to manage our own minds and convince us that our enemy is other than it really is.
Thank you. Gabriel, please tell our audience how they can follow your important work. We're running out of time here.
I've got a website, GabrielRockhill.com. I'm also on Substack, and I try to keep that updated with recent interviews and publications. I also direct the Critical Theory Workshop. So criticaltheoryworkshop.com is a portal to a lot of the collective projects that I'm involved in.
The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guests, not those of WBAI or the Pacifica Foundation. That wraps up our show for today. Thank you, Gabriel. We hope to have you back. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter X, and Podbeam. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Gloria, you cut that way short. We have about 5 to 7 minutes left.
It's, my thing says 12:02. Okay, so we can still continue. And
yeah, about at least, like one more question, another 5 minutes or so.
Okay.
About 5 minutes.
Just in the interest, if you do have another question, I was really intrigued by your opening and how identity politics relates to imperialism. If you have a question organically, I'm happy to follow your lead, but otherwise maybe something about that could be helpful.
Go ahead, please.
Should I go ahead, or do you want to phrase a question, or I'll just go with it.
Yeah, just go ahead.
Okay. The other thing that I wanted to say about identity politics is that you have to recognize that there were very important class struggles from below by racialized, gendered groups that then there was an endeavor on the part of the ruling class and their managers to capture that radical energy, but to diffuse it and disconnect it from its class politics so it could become just about forms of representation, and more specifically about managing certain constituencies like racialized groups that were quite radical in the 60s, for instance, or the women's movement, and prop up in the middle layer, the professional managerial class stratum, spokespeople who could basically toe the line of liberal or radical liberal talking points while seeming to and maybe appearing to address some of the concerns of the broad masses, but doing it in such a way that it's disconnected from class struggle and class analysis. And this is an important way in which the professional managerial class in the imperial core functions as the primary vehicle for a lot of identity politics. And it's for this reason as well that we have to recognize, and I'll give a big shout out to the excellent work of Adolph Reed Jr. in this regard, that identity politics itself is a class politics. It's a class politics about the advancement of the professional managerial class and the various spokespeople who purport to speak for a particular constituency, while of course never giving them a platform, right? So the contradiction should be apparent. But the other thing I wanted to highlight is the specificity of how US American identity politics relates to neoliberal imperialism. And the US has been identified historically as a racial apartheid form of statecraft, so much so, of course, that the Nazis came and studied it because it was recognized as the global leader in racial apartheid statecraft. But as it transitioned in the latter half of the 20th century into the neoliberal phase, one of the things that it attempted to do through proxy wars, neoliberalism, neocolonialism, and other ventures was to construct an empire that was increasingly invisible. So it didn't look like and couldn't easily be identified like the British Empire or the French Empire or other earlier empires. And one way of doing that was to provide spokespeople in the professional managerial class who look like the victims of imperialism, but repeat the talking points of the imperial ruling class. In that regard, that class politics has to be understood not only domestically in terms of managing the kind of more radical elements of the racialized and gendered working class, but also internationally by shoring up a kind of image of the United States as a diverse country in which, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and figures like this could be in the administration, which at least communicates to those hoodwinked by these projects that somehow there is deep diversity within the US empire. Therefore, maybe it isn't even an empire because people who look like the victims of empire are actually given positions of power. The final thing that I would say, though, is it is very true under the Trump administration that there's another version of identity politics that's being pushed very hard, and that is white supremacist identity politics. And so the attack that you hear on quote unquote woke identity politics is just an attack on the versions of identity politics that are identified with racialized, gendered, and other sexual groups. But it's nonetheless a form of identity politics. And once again, a class identity politics, a white supremacist Epstein class version of identity politics.
Well, there was what I wanted to say is there's this, I don't know if I could find it. I was looking for it. There's this video that Jimmy Dore had put up, which was a CIA agent talking about her intersectionality. I don't know if you've ever seen that one. It's hysterical. Did you saw it?
The advertisement that they did?
Yeah.
There were a few of them. They're hilarious.
I wish we could find one of those to play, but they're smart. The CIA is smart. You put in an asset that you can't really object to. I mean, if you're going to infiltrate the Proud Boys, you're going to do it with a really buff white guy who likes to shoot guns and drink beer. And if you're going to infiltrate the left, you're going to pick someone who is intersectional and clicks every box. And that's how it's done. I mean, they recruit people who speak various languages in the Arab world, specifically so that they can be infiltrators. So I think that really goes to your point. I think that's one other thing, but I'll come back to it. Oh, Jeremy's, I think, outside.
Yeah, no,
So,
absolutely. There's a way that they choose certain, or I should say that they mobilize woke identity politics as a way of trying to provide cover for empire building. And there wasn't just one ad, if I remember correctly, there were a series of ads that were also with people who self-identify as queer or gender ambiguous, or I can't remember the details of some of the others, but there was a kind of wave of woke recruitment ads for the Central Intelligence Agency, which I agree is quite witty on their part, because what they're looking to do is to present the agency as itself being somehow leftist. And this really kind of comes full circle to the origin of the beginning point of our conversation. And that is that identity politics, at least in this restricted kind of liberal sense, isn't really a left politics insofar as historically, at least, the left has been understood as anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. It is instead a way of propping up a faux left that focuses on these identity categories that can then be weaponized for imperial endeavors, as they have been by the CIA in various and sundry ways. And this is, of course, ongoing.
I remembered what my point. Whoops.
No,
It's a
I
quick
just
one,
flashed
Jer.
that for my editing purposes because I think
Oh, okay.
that is where I know I can use for the
Okay.
editing job.
Just
Go
one
ahead.
one
If
point.
you want to keep talking, go ahead. I just needed to see that visual
Well,
cue.
okay. Now I think I forgot what I was going to say. It's short, but okay. Somebody else talk for a second so I can like pull it back in.
well, and in many ways, these I think a lot of people don't realize how a lot of these, professors that they really are using the academy as part of this manipulation that you're describing. And most people don't realize that. And a lot of these people, play the role of professor very well, but it seems that they are also, tied with the NED they get money from these corporate foundations. And so really they're playing that role within the academy. I think it's two sides of the same coin. And I think, your work is very important in that intellectual history. I mean, there are not many books. There's the Francis Stoner Saunders had a good book on the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which I think you draw on when you give an overview of that in your book. So, but I think you've broken new ground, and show how they manipulate the political theory field. And hopefully some of the articles I'm doing, maybe somebody would expand on my research and produce a book about that, because you can look at other fields. Like, I'm familiar with also the history field is really heavy into this identity politics. And actually the World Socialist website had a critique of the New York Times, did this was it Project 619 or something, where they tried to reduce all of American history to racism, and some of it were these black intellectuals. And the World Socialist website has pushed back with some leading, historians who said that they're distorting history, and that they're totally taking class out of the equation. They're making everything about race, taking class. And I know from applying for academic job that they're just a cottage industry of jobs available in like African American history, but nothing as far as labor history is still barely taught, let alone the history of U.S. imperialism is not taught at all. And often, peace groups are still maligned in history textbooks. Like, I had an article, because each year I try and do a back to school special for the covert action to spotlight these kind of issues. So last year I focused on history and how they're not teaching the CIA history, the history of American empire, the class, class division. They're good on race. I mean, on one hand, it is good because, as we know, African Americans were mistreated, and historically, that history was buried. So, I mean, at least they're teaching a critical history of slavery, but they're kind of overdoing it and all that, and leaving out the class dimension. So, and labor history. So it all kind of fits into what you're saying, just how the academy. I mean, it's one part of a bigger story, a bigger propaganda effort, I would say, and divide and conquer strategy. But it is one vital arena, and I think people should better understand that. Maybe there'd be more pushback.
I think that's a good
I
point.
just want to add, our September 10th show is going to be on that topic.
Yeah.
It's our back to school special with Ned. Ned invades universities and fake professors. So, if you want to come back on the 10th, that'd be great. It's always fun. The one thing I wanted to say is, I was an economics undergrad, and I went to a very radical school. And part of my economics education was, of course, taking, the classical courses, the macro, micro, beginning courses, intermediate, kind of advanced courses. And then after we finished that whole thing, we were taught radical economics. And one of my professors was an MIT graduate, and he had us reading Das Kapital cover to cover. Each week we discussed one chapter. And nobody has read this except very few people. And if you read this, you really do understand Marx's thinking. It's not cultural Marxism, folks. It's critical analysis. And it's extremely useful because it looks at how everything is organized. And a concept that nobody talks about anymore is the concept of alienation, and the concept of how important it is to have a meaningful life, to do work that you feel good about, that you're proud of, and how that kind of connects to your soul, and how work is the manifestation of almost a spiritual connection to life. So one of the things that Marx really talks about that we all should focus on is how important work is, and what they do in this kind of capitalist class type way is they try to take this from us, and we become deskilled. We become automated, so that instead of, let's say, producing a leather bag from beginning to end and then being an artisan and a creator, we are now standing on an assembly line, putting on one button every bag for 8 hours, and how that is dehumanizing and how it destroys the human spirit. And we don't talk about that, but that's a huge thing that goes on psychologically to our working class. They are just being numbed and beaten at every interval with this de-skilling and this alienation from themselves and their own creativity. So, Marx is not the Communist Manifesto. And every time I go into one of these, kind of billionaire funded organizations that are supposedly left, every young boy who's like 22, quotes from the Communist Manifesto. And, I've come to believe that that's what the CIA hands out to their juniors. It's like, read this, quote this, you don't have to learn anything else, and then people will believe that you're real. and the critical analytical thought, which is the cornerstone of this Marxist analysis, this critical analysis, is so important to understand.
Another operation that they've undertaken is they've tried to separate the deep Marxist tradition from humanism by claiming that there's a humanist Marxism that is distinct from actually existing socialism. Not that the project of, for instance, just as an example, elevating 850 million people out of extreme poverty in China wasn't a humanist project. I think it's very clear that Marxism and humanism go hand in hand because, as you say, it's really about addressing the ways that the capitalist system turns us into cogs that really are just ground down into, almost nothing of a human is left. And part of the socialist project is, if you can use the value produced by workers to support them in their livelihoods, you can also allow them to grow as people, become cultured, educated. I mean, the socialist state building projects, look at Cuba. One of the first goals was to make the population literate. And they did that within a year. Capitalism had left the more or less, overwhelming majority of the population illiterate for decades, centuries. And so that humanism really has to be centered so that we can push back against the propaganda that consists in trying to convince us that somehow Marxism is this anti-humanist project that just kills hundreds of millions of people and is terroristic and things like this. This is just a case of liberal projection at the end of the day. What they're describing is the capitalist world system, not Marxism.
And then one point of clarification I'd like to make is, these countries such as Nicaragua, they get this press that they're authoritarian. And, when we look at what's going on, Nicaragua kicked out all of the media that is funded by net.
Yeah.
So it's not that they're authoritarian, it's that they're being practical. I mean, and then, when we found in 2018, and we had a show on this, the alleged students, which were really mercenaries, firebombed their radio station, Radio Ya, and we brought on one of their I guess disc jockeys or reporters, and he explained what it was like having your radio station firebombed, and that's what the U.S. does through covert operations. So so the government throwing out Ned people because they're foreign funded. I mean, the United States has all kinds of foreign rules where you can't donate money, or you'd have to do that. So nothing that they were saying or doing was out of step with what any country would do to protect itself from foreign invasion.
Yeah, the label of authoritarianism is often just used to slander struggles for sovereignty. As soon as a state tries to exercise its sovereign right to oversee what forms of media are operative, whether or not they're people's media or media that educates their population versus imperialist propaganda, then they're accused of being authoritarian. While at the same time, of course, few people would accuse the United States of being authoritarian, in spite of the fact that they have an incredible, even totalitarian control of the media landscape, and they exercise that power quite indiscriminately. And we've seen it again and again, with them banning various platforms, scrubbing YouTube of certain sources and other such things. So anytime I hear the word authoritarianism, I do always ask the question, well, is that really the case? Or is this just the exercise of sovereignty against imperialist interests,
And
which is usually justified?
And they've
Well,
equated authoritarianism with the left, the real left, the socialism and the communism and authoritarianism all go together.
Yeah.
Instead of recognizing that any form of government can become authoritarian. It's not a left-wing thing, but that in America, authoritarianism is absolutely associated with the left. And when you talk to just normies who aren't really invested in political science or anything like that, that's what they believe. It's like they automatically think of socialism or left-wing politics as authoritarianism. They equate those things. And I don't know how you break that, you break through to those people, because those are the people that need to understand, need to listen to this show. They need to understand that the authoritarianism is what we have in our government. And our government is nothing like a socialist government. It is a almost full-blown gun-ho capitalist government, and it has been my entire lifetime. And that's been many, many, many decades.
Well, hopefully
So-
CNN will run this discussion, and then we'll be able to reach the
you'll
masses,
never,
right?
you'll never see this.
Then we'll
I
see
think-
true democratic media space, right?
Gabriel, I think you might have said this, or maybe I read it somewhere else, but we were free to speak in this country. We're just not free to be heard.
Yeah. that's
So,
exactly-
you know, we can say whatever we want, but we're shadow banned. And you can
Well, and
tell.
don't
I mean,
forget that the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and some of the
per
worst
capita.
prison conditions, and a lot of injustice in the prison system that would rival or eclipse other countries that are supposedly so authoritarian. So you can bring that up anytime anyone, you know, and that's something the NED, they're so concerned about authoritarian and human rights, but never addressing any problems in the United States.
Yeah.
So,
I'm almost certain that the prison population in the United States, at least a few years ago, outstripped the highest prison population in the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'd have to
written,
check that.
I've written 2 articles on this under
You
a
have,
pseudonym called Lauren Smith, and they're both published by Covert Action Magazine. And I
Oh,
talk
I'll look them
about
up.
the healthcare system in the prison system, and I also
Yeah,
talk
they're
about
feeding them like dog
food.
food, and you know the condition in American, like in Oklahoma, because I have covered local criminal justice issues for local newspapers as a side job, and they're major, huge human rights abuses, torturing people, and there was one state senator who was trying to expose this. He chaired a hearing that I went to, the Oklahoma City Capitol, and they had prison guard testifying that they're torture. You know, they didn't have enough guard because they cut the budgets. So the inmates are running the prison. They're extorting people. They're torturing them. They had video, and there's nobody to control this. The guards are totally corrupt, and there are people dying in these prisons. And a lot of time they're unjustly incarcerated because the police. There's so many cases of wrongful incarceration. So it's a human rights horror story here in the United States and states like Oklahoma.
And you know, I've written extensively about the kidnapping of President Maduro and the First Lady, and it's criminal. It's just it's criminal what we do, and you know, it's just I'm just besides myself. But you know, there's articles on this that I've written under my name in Covert Action Magazine.
I'm going to look them up, but if for any reason I can't find them, would you mind sharing them? Because I'd love to read them.
Oh, thank you.
I haven't
Yeah,
read
sure.
those. I read Covert Action Mag all the time, but I missed those for some reason.
Have
You're doing
you
great
written?
work, by the way.
Yeah,
Covert
hopefully you
Action?
can write for Covert Action when you have some
We
free
want
time.
to.
Or even just a
I'd
short
be
piece, you know,
give-
excerpt from something else you've written, send it to me and we'll publish it.
I'd be
And-
honored, especially given not only the great work that you've been doing, but
Thank you.
the legacy and the history of it is.
Yeah.
I think it's just
And
fantastic.
Jeremy, could you give him a book review?
Yeah, we're supposed to have some people review it, but they didn't review it for some reason. They didn't follow through. But yeah, but that was interesting what you're saying at the beginning. All these attacks you were getting, and I mean, meanwhile, the book, you know, I read it, and I mean, it's very well. It's a well-written book, but it's very well grounded, and even I think you're very balanced. Like with the Marcuse, you don't go where the evidence isn't. Like you don't say, you know, since there's some ambiguities with him and like nuance with him. I think you cover that very judiciously. And I'm interested in Marcuse because I actually went to Brandeis and I was just always
I saw that.
interested in him.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, he was a teacher there and that's where his papers are. And, you know, I was interested in the 60s era and I knew a lot about him before and I'd read some of his stuff. So I was very interested in that aspect of your book. But yeah, I found you covered it in a very judicious way, very scholarly way, and it was good information. And whatever your view on Marcuse is, I think anyone should consult your book for that. So, I mean, these attacks are just completely off kilter, and unfortunately, yeah, that's what we're seeing in the academy today. I mean, I've experienced that myself, and it's just like a modern day McCarthyism, and there's no standard. Like they're right. These are supposedly distinguished people, and as you say, they're just engaging these hit pieces with no substance.
Yeah.
It's sad. I mean,
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that we found with uncontrolled opposition and where we got the name is that we find that if you're in the left and you're criticizing the right, you get air. You get some standing. And if you're in the right and you're criticizing the left, you also get some standing. But if you are really honestly looking at the situation with an unbiased lens, and you are criticizing what is wrong and being truthful, you are shadow banned and attacked. So I think the danger is that you are honest. You know, if you
Well,
are,
the left doesn't like to be criticized, and they assume you're from the right. Like they'll automatically label you, oh, you're a rightist or reactionary. But they don't want to accept criticism from somebody who's on the left. And then, yeah, a lot of it is infiltration.
Yeah. I also think, though, that we're not in the 90s anymore. And these people, many of those who have attacked me they know full well what reality looks like, at least to some extent. And they also recognize that their narrative is slipping. And that makes them that much more hysterical and outrageous in the things that they'll say and do. Because some of the hit pieces on me, it's like somebody admitted they didn't even read the book, but they wrote a review anyway. A lot of ad hominem slander, complete misrepresentations of anything in the book. I say the opposite regularly of what some of these reviews say. So I think that there was a real, almost hysterical need to try to consolidate the narrative, ban me as a voice from any respectable spaces, so that they could kind of pretend as if it's the 90s again and the grand era of end of communism, end of history, and all of that. But it's not. And they're feeling the heat. And so I actually think it's quite a good thing. And I'm glad that they went after me, because it also then creates more of a rallying point around, and a recognition on the part of many of those who see exactly what they're doing. They're just kind of rabid guard dogs at this point in time.
And it
And
kind of
so,
exposes them, that
exactly.
there's no substance to what they're saying. They don't even read the book. They use these vicious smears, and they're behaving, some are exposed as because that's the techniques of U.S. intelligence agencies, to just smear people, and that's the same technique they're using. And they're showing who they are. They're either directly tied to these intelligence agencies, or they've somehow adopted their modus operandi. And I agree, more people are seeing through that, and they're kind of discredited. And I don't know how that will play out in the future, but
Fight goes on, right?
yeah, I mean, some of them still occupy very prestigious jobs and positions in the academy, but the level of respect for them may be declining.
I think so. I mean, I think that the Guardian letter and the debacle around that is a positive sign. It's the first time that I've seen one of those letters go around that got so much pushback, and then people were jumping ship. During the war in Syria, that wasn't going on, or Libya, or other cases. So I think there are at least some positive signs. But I agree. I mean, they have a lot of power and a lot of influence. So I don't take any of them lightly. I just looked really quickly and couldn't find. You said Lawrence Smith was the name you wrote these articles under?
Yeah, Lauren Smith, on Covert Action. Lauren, Lauren Smith.
Okay.
I was contacted by this CIA agent when I was writing against the infiltration, and I called it what did I call it? Contra Round 2. This was in 2018, and some CIA agent contacted me, and his last name was Smith. So I decided I would write under Lauren Smith.
One other point, and I may have to leave in a minute or two, but there was a good article related to some of the points you're making today on class issues. There was actually a good critique of John Mearsheimer. I mean, he has a lot of good critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy, but there was a critical article today about him on Counterpunch, which normally has been kind of wishy-washy recently, but this was a good article showing how Mearsheimer doesn't address a class analysis of U.S. foreign policy in his critique, and it's a very limited critique he offers, although he's kind of built up, even on the left, as this wise sage and kind of guru, but there's no class analysis that he's presenting. And that was true. I noticed that with like Andrew Bacevich. These guys are a little more in the mainstream, like Andrew Bacevich.
Yeah.
He was pretty critical of U.S. foreign policy, and he's a nice guy. I met him once because I attended one of his talks. He's a very nice guy, but he doesn't adopt class analysis, and
Yeah.
that may be why they're kind of acceptable. The
Totally.
Mearsheimer, the Bacevich, where the people who write for Monthly Review, who develop real good analysis of the roots of U.S. imperialism and the class dimensions, they're never promoted, like even in the YouTube sphere.
Totally.
So it kind of gets at what you're saying. Like there's a certain range of dissent that's permissible, and the Mearsheimer still has a very successful career and
Yeah.
big following because he stops short of a class
That's it.
analysis.
Yeah. I see it's by Gerald Sussman. I just pulled it up. He wrote
Yeah,
a
and
good
that's a
book.
good article, and he's written
Yeah.
for Covert Action before. He's a good guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I like he wrote a book on democracy promotion, I think it's called. It's really
Hmm.
quite good.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll read it. Thank you for the
Yeah.
reference. I'm gonna unfortunately have to run as well, but I'm
Yeah. I
really
have to
glad that we
run.
Thank
Yeah.
you. This is very
connected
generous.
in person, or not in person, but virtually. But I look
Yeah. This
forward
has
to
been a
staying in
great
touch.
discussion. Thanks so much for coming
Yeah.
on, and
I
you've
really
had great
appreciate the work you're
insights.
doing,
Yeah.
and let's stay in touch and find other opportunities.
Absolutely. Let's work together. Yeah.
Let's do it for sure.
Thank you.
All right. Well,
Absolutely. This was great.
Okay.
And Gabriel, like if I was doing my own show, I would say a lot of the things you're saying, but I would not be able to put it in such an articulate manner and be as eloquent as you've been on this subject. But
I appreciate that. Thank you.
and it's the kind of stuff I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. But
Fantastic. Tell
uh,
me, Jaime, how, just so that I know, so I can help as well boost it, will you edit all of this then and post it on
yeah,
YouTube?
I'm
Yeah,
gonna
I'm going to
edit.
post it actually on Substack in about the next 30 minutes. So I'll send you an email and you can promote it. Yeah, because I join your Facebook. Yeah, thanks for promoting my article.
That is a great
I
article.
check
Yeah.
my Facebook usually once or twice a day. So yeah, I'll email you in the next 30 minutes and you can promote it on Facebook or wherever. Yeah.
And
And
then,
next week,
Jayme edits it for
yeah,
the
next
radio.
week on Tuesday, I
Yeah, then it'll
publish like
appear next
a
week on the
radio
radio.
cut version for it, and
Okay.
it's suitable for podcasts as well. A very good listen because it's if you like listening to the exact same amount of time on something, it's precisely 55 minutes every week. So,
Perfect.
but I will send that out as well on Tuesday,
Great.
and that's an audio only version of the show.
But yeah, it'll air
Well,
on the WBAI next Thursday, I think.
Tuesdays.
Oh,
Tuesday at
Tuesday.
4 p.m. Tuesday at
Okay.
4.
okay. Well, I will circulate them once I see them. So really
Great.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Well,
Take
thanks
care.
again. We'll be in touch. Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone.
I think that'll
Okay.
do it for the show today. So everybody's ready to go. This was a good discussion. I love this topic. It's one I think we need to really reach out to everybody else. So thank you, Gabriel, for joining us. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with another episode. This is Uncontrolled Apposition. Craig Pasta Jardula is our executive producer, and that's why we're on the channel Pasta to Go. So we will be back next week. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.